This morning the sermon is going to be taken from the book of Job. And we're going to do some reading together and draw some lessons from this book. Time doesn't permit us to go into detail on matters like the background of the book, or really a lot of detail on anything. But leading into that, I would simply remind us that the setting of the book of Job is back in the days of the patriarchs, that it predates the time of the law of Moses. And so we're introduced to this great man from the east, from the far east. And he was a very wealthy man, and he had a large family. But that's not what's important about him. What is important is what is said in the first verse, in Job 1, in verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. This is said in the first verse. It's important for us to see that this is God's assessment of Job. Satan, our adversary, that false accuser, appeared in the presence of the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan in verse 8, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil?" This is what God said about Job. And this brings us really to what is the proposition of the book. And it's something that's so easily missed as people look to other points that are seen in the book, but this is key right here. Verse 9, Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for nothing?" I want you to understand that in this book of 42 chapters, that's going to be the question, and that's going to be the question that is answered. That is to say, as we develop Satan's charge, he only fears you because, of course, anybody would. Look at how you've blessed him. Of course he fears you. Of course. But if you take away those blessings, that would be different. Verse 11, Satan says, "But now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." And so Satan's charge is, Job does not serve you because he just loves you, because you're God. He doesn't serve you just because you're his creator and he's the creature. It's because of the blessings. It's a conditional thing. You give him good things, and so of course he serves you. Now, we have 66 books in the Bible. The Bible is a book, but it's a library of 66 books. But each one of them contributes something significant that's unique. It's different from the other books. And the book of Job, like no other book in the Bible, deals with this question. On what basis should we serve God? And so in the first development here, as we look at that proposition, in the first development, God allows Satan to take away all those blessings that the first chapter starts with. Back then, a man's wealth would especially be reckoned in his livestock and his land and crops and so forth, and all of these things, his many oxen, his donkeys, his sheep, his servants, his camels, all of this was taken away. But worse than any of that, I said he had a large family. He had 10 children, and all of them. Can you imagine? The loss of one child is just unthinkable. Can you imagine losing all 10 of your 10 children in one day? So you see, everything that he possessed, everything is taken away. So how does Job respond to that? In verse 20 of Job chapter 1, Job 1 verse 20, Job's a robe, tore his robe, that's a sign of grief. shaved his head, he's mourning. The text says he fell to the ground and worshiped, and he said, naked came I from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin, nor charge God with wrong. One translation says, charge God foolishly. A lot of foolish things are said about God, especially when people are suffering. Job did not do that. But the proposition is developed further when God now has another meeting with Satan, our adversary. And in verse 3 of chapter 2, I'm in Job 2 and verse 3, now God speaks again. And he says, have you considered my servant Job? That there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil. And he holds fast to his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without cause. So, what about it, Satan? You said he served me because all of the blessings, they're all gone now, and he still holds fast to me. Skin for skin, you told me not to touch him. You let me at him, and you'll see. Verse 5, stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will surely curse you to your face. And basically in verse 6, the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand, but spare his life. In other words, just don't kill him. And so the next development is Job has already lost everything in terms of blessings in this life, and now he loses his health. The next verse says that Satan struck him, verse 7, with painful boils from the sole of his foot.
You show none of you cranial.
Say that.
To the crown of his head. He was reduced in verse 8 to the situation. I saw a piece of broken pottery yesterday, and I thought of this passage. He took for himself a potsherd with which to scrape himself while he sat in the midst of the ashes. So he's lost his health. And may I say, he lost the support of his wife. You judge for yourself. As you read verse 9 of chapter 2, then his wife said to him, do you still hold to your integrity? Curse God and die. But he said to her, verse 10, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God? And shall we not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. And so what happens is, the first 2 chapters sets the stage, really, for the rest of the book. But it's important to see those first 2 chapters before you get into all the conversations with his friends and all the various avenues and sometimes rabbit trails that it seems that they're running, the friends I'm speaking of. A lot of what they say is good. Much of it is misdirected, though, and much of it Job already knew, as he himself would tell them. But as I say, here's the proposition. On what basis does a man serve God? Is it because he's God and we are his creature, because he's the creator? Are we, therefore, is it of necessity that we seek him and want to do his will? And it's not a matter, it's conditional that if he gives me that, if I get the spouse that I want, if I get the family, if I get the house I want or the job I want, then I'll serve him. Is that the basis? Or is it because he's God? Is he worthy of our praise apart from any of the blessings he bestows? No other book in the Bible addresses that so candidly and exhaustively as the book of Job. So here's the short version of what happens. His 3 friends make a trip to see him. And when they arrive, Job is so emaciated by the disease that he has, at first they do not recognize him. And they sat for 7 days and said nothing. Then the conversations start. And you have Job lamenting in chapter 3. In chapter 4, here's the way we're going to sum it up. Job has 3 friends. Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar. And they're all going to take turns speaking back and forth. A friend will speak, Job will answer. A friend will speak, Job will answer, and so forth. And then we learn all of a sudden toward the end of the book that there's another character there who hasn't said anything. We don't know yet that he's there till he speaks up, and his name is Elihu, and he's going to speak. And so let's just summarize that, and then God is going to speak. So we'll summarize that, and then we'll look at some of those lessons that we must learn that are there for our learning. How can we sum up what Eliphaz says? Well, here's the way he starts out in chapter 4 of the book of Job. Eliphaz starts speaking, and in verse 3 he says, "Surely you have instructed many, and you have strengthened weak hands. Your words have upheld him who was stumbling, and you have strengthened the feeble knees. But now it comes upon you, and you're weary. You have taught others. You've instructed others. You've told them how they should act. And here, the first time you have trouble, you fall apart." Well, you can imagine how helpful that was. But that's how Eliphaz starts. When Job answers, he acknowledges in chapter 6 and verse 3. Chapter 6, verse 3, the latter part of it, he says, "Therefore my words have been rash." You know, sometimes you say things and it's the hurt talking. You're not quite at yourself. And Job acknowledges in chapter 6 and verse 3 his words have been rash. But he said in verse 14, "To him who is afflicted, kindness should be shown by his friend." The least you could do is extend kindness to me as a friend. Well, let's sum up what Bildad says. Bildad. Let's turn to chapter 8. Now this, if you thought Eliphaz was helpful, you know I'm speaking ironically, don't you? But if you thought that friend was helpful, well, let's look at some more things. Bildad comes along. In verse 4, here's what he says. You know, we've already mentioned the loss of all of his children, the deaths that took place. In chapter 8, verse 4, "If your sons have sinned against him, he's cast them away for their transgression." Well, that's helpful, isn't it? You've had children, well, that's because they were sinners. Then he says in verse 5, "If you would earnestly seek God and make your supplication to the Almighty," as if Job's not doing that. Verse 6, "If you were pure and upright." See, that's the problem. You're not pure and upright. And Job, as they go back and forth, Job's not going to just say, "Well, yeah, you're right, you know." He's going to say, "Listen, I know that I've sinned." Who has not sinned? But that cannot be why this is happening. It cannot be because I've forsaken God. It cannot be because I no longer love him. It's not because I'm somehow more wicked than other people and he's really singling me out. I don't know the reason, but I know it can't be that. And their response is just going to be to ramp it up. Job, maybe you didn't get it. It couldn't be coming upon you like this unless you were especially wicked, if you just confess it. And so it's going to go back and forth. By the way, in Job chapter 9, as he answers Bildad in verse 2, "Truly I know it is so, but how can a man be righteous before God?" And so what he does is to talk about how wise God is, verse 4, and how great God is. And his work, verse 9, "He made the Bear, Orion, the Pleiades." But it's pitiful as you look on down to verse 21. Job says, "I am blameless, yet I do not know myself. I despise my life." If you think you have some depression sometimes and you're down a little bit, at least 3 times in the book of Job I saw where he used that expression, "I despise my life." There are other places where he says, I wish I'd never been born. And so he's really a man who is hurting. Well, let's see if Zophar will help. We turn to chapter 11 in Job. In Job 11 and verse 6, I'm starting kind of in the middle of the verse where the sentence is. He says, know therefore that God exacts from you less than your iniquity deserves. Chapter 11, verse 6. Job, he hasn't punished you nearly as much as he should. He's held back a lot. Less than your iniquity deserves. Well, look at what Job says in Job 13. In Job 13, verse 4, but you are forgers of lies. You are all worthless physicians. And he will go on to say in chapter 16 and verse 2, miserable comforters are you all. Well, let's pass a few chapters and go to chapter 36, where Elihu is speaking. And a key verse that I want to notice that sums up at least what his intentions are. In chapter 36 and verse 2, he says, bear with me a little and I will show you there are yet words to speak on God's behalf. So he's trying to do that. But he also doesn't really have the answers. Now, we said that God speaks. In chapter 38, the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? And verse 4, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. And God speaks in chapter 40. Well, he's speaking in all these chapters. I'm just selecting a couple of verses. Chapter 40, verse 2, verse 1 and 2. The Lord answered Job and said, chapter 40, verse 2, shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? He who rebukes God, let him answer it. What's God saying? Well, Job, you're right. I owe you an explanation for this. Let me tell you something. God doesn't owe us anything. And God does not owe us an explanation for anything. And so Job speaks. In chapter 40 and verse 3, Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yet twice, but I will proceed no further. And the book is going to conclude with Job's restoration to health and abundance of blessings. And by the way, he is offering sacrifices for his friends that God said have not spoken what is right about me as my servant Job has. Well, let's wrap this up. We've looked at some responses to his friends, but I've kind of saved the best for last. What is central in what keeps Job going through the unthinkable that would seem to be so unbearable? In chapter 13 and verse 15, he says, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. In chapter 19, verse 25, I know that my Redeemer lives. And so for Job, the question is answered. He did not serve God because of the things that God gave him, and even his own health that had been so good. He served God because he was God. He saw God as worthy of his praise and devotion, completely apart from anything that he bestows upon us. That's the lesson that we need to get from the book of Job. To trust God. To trust Jesus. And so many passages appeal to that very point. On the night in which Jesus knew his disciples were sore troubled, the apostles, he said in John 14, beginning at verse 1, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. I go to prepare a place for you. If it were not so, I would have told you. Paul would say in Acts chapter 27 and verse 23, the angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve spoke to me. He said in verse 25, therefore I believe that it shall happen just as it has been told me. That kind of faith that will hold on to the Lord no matter what. That will sustain you if you do have to bury a son. That will sustain you when you bury your parents. It will sustain you if you bury a grandchild. In all these things, we're more than conquerors, Paul said in Romans 8:31 through 38. He is the God that holds our breath in his hand. In Daniel 5, Daniel rebuked Belshazzar because he says, you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze and iron, of wood and stone, who neither see nor hear nor know. And the God in whose hand your breath is and whose are all your ways, you've not glorified. What's true of Belshazzar on that point is true of us. God holds our breath in his hand. He gives unto all life and breath and all things. Shall the clay say to the potter, why have you made me thus? And so the two lessons, and we conclude. To trust God. Secondly, to remember who God is and who we are. He's the potter. We're the clay. He's the creator. We're his creature. And so we thank him for his blessings. We enjoy the blessings. But we serve God because he is God. And we have an anchor that keeps the soul steadfast and sure, though the billows roll. This is why we study last Sunday and Wednesday night the word amen, because he is the God of amen. In him the promises of God are amen. It is certain. It is true. How great thou art. Let all the people say amen. I wonder, is there someone this morning that has not yet rendered obedience to the gospel? That's the most important decision you'll ever make. And we would encourage you, as Jesus calls you through the gospel, to respond from the heart in obedience to the doctrine to which you have been taught as we stand and sing.